Think of the building that you're in right now. It's tempting to think of it as just the beams, columns, and slabs providing structural support that gives you a shelter. But a modern building has so much more going on. There's the electrical system, which takes power from outside and powers everything inside the building. A plumbing system, which takes fresh water into the building and flushes out all the waste. A ventilation system, which brings in fresh air and takes out the used air. A modern building even have data and control systems which can do everything from automatically open window blinds to keep out burglars. Engineers who designed these systems, beginning in ancient Egypt through Da Vinci and others in the Middle Ages and to modern-day computer scientists working on artificial intelligence algorithms, have looked for inspiration to the human body. Just as in the building systems we just saw, human organ systems are tasked with specific crucial functions. The respiratory system, with the lung at its core, responsible for ventilation. The skeletal and muscular system giving us structural support and the ability to move. The digestive system and the related urinary system, allowing us to take in fuel and water and excrete the byproducts. A circulatory system with the heart at the center, getting blood, nutrients and oxygen throughout the body. A lymphatic system which transports disease-fighting antibody-rich white blood cells. The nervous system, responsible for all data collection and analysis. The endocrine and exocrine system of glands, responsible for secreting vital hormones. And finally, the reproductive system, because unlike buildings, humans have a need to reproduce. We'll be looking at some of these systems briefly, by starting with the ventilation. How the human respiratory system takes oxygen in and waste gases out. In charge of ventilating your body and getting the oxygen it requires. In charge of ventilating your body and getting the oxygen it requires is the respiratory system, with a pair of lungs at its center. Oxygen is an essential ingredient in most fuel-burning reactions, which is why your first instinct when you see a couch on fire is to throw a blanket on it and deprive it of the oxygen it needs to burn. And so oxygen is required in the human body too, to aid in cellular metabolism, the process where cells burn fuel or nutrients to release energy at the cellular level. And the way oxygen gets into your body is either through the nose into the nasal cavity or mouth into the oral cavity. In other words, you can breathe through your nose and your mouth. The two cavities open up at the back of your throat into the pharynx. The pharynx splits into two pipes, a food pipe going down to your stomach and a windpipe down to your lungs. And because the pharynx takes food from the mouth, it can accidentally slip down the wrong pipe or choking. That's food in the windpipe. At the top of the windpipe is the larynx, meant exclusively for air. The stuff we've covered thus far makes the upper respiratory system. So if your pediatrician says that your daughter has an upper respiratory infection, it means either her nose, pharynx or larynx is swollen up. Carrying the air down the larynx is a pipe shown here in blue called the trachea. The trachea then splits into a left and right bronchus, taking air to the left and right lung respectively. If you've ever had a persistent cough that the doctor diagnosed as bronchitis, it's an infection of this, the bronchus. Each bronchus then splits into thousands of finer tubes called the bronchi, and at the end of each bronchi are thousands of air sacs called the alveoli. That's basically what your lung is, hundreds of millions of alveoli. And it's in the alveoli that the magic happens. The blood requiring oxygen, always blue, is brought here from the heart by the artery. It gets oxygenated at the alveoli, and the blood full of oxygen, always red, is taken back to the heart in the veins, where it gets to the rest of the body, providing vital oxygen to keep the cellular metabolism going. The trachea, bronchi, and the lungs themselves form the lower respiratory system. An infection here is much harder to get to and treat. The upper and lower respiratory systems together forms one of the most efficient ventilation systems anywhere.
We've all experienced the lure of a delicious home-cooked meal. As the aroma of the food being cooked fills the home, we find ourselves drawn to the kitchen. Our curiosity about what is being cooked is not the only thing that is awakened. The aroma of the food entering through our nose activates our complex and symbiotic digestive system, starting with the salivary glands, which secrete saliva containing starch-digesting enzymes. Once the food is in the mouth, the saliva, teeth, and tongue work together to break down the food through a process called mastication. The saliva helps in breaking down the chemicals in the food. The teeth help in chewing the food and making the food mushy and easy to swallow. And when you are ready to swallow, the tongue pushes the food to the pharynx, at the back of the throat. With the food in the pharynx, a self-closing valve called the epiglottis prevents it from going down the windpipe and into the lungs. We've all experienced what happens when we eat or drink too quickly and get a choking sensation. That's the epiglottis not having enough time to close. Instead, from the pharynx, the food is pushed down the esophagus, a 25 centimeter long tube that connects to the stomach. As the food makes its way down to the stomach, the muscles of the esophagus continue to break down the food. What goes down stays down. On either end of the esophagus are two muscles or sphincters that regulate the movement of the food. The upper esophageal sphincter opens up during swallowing to let food into the esophagus, but immediately closes so the food doesn't come back into the mouth. The lower esophageal sphincter opens up to let the food into the stomach to be worked on by gastric juices, but does not allow movement the other way. Sometimes the lower esophageal sphincter malfunctions and stomach acids get into the esophagus, leading to an overall sense of unease. This condition is called acid reflux disease, commonly referred to as acidity in India. Happiness rarely keeps company with an empty stomach. Central to our state of mind and a key component of the digestive process, the stomach is a crescent-shaped organ composed mostly of low-strength hydrochloric acid. Once the food enters the stomach, special cells within the stomach are activated by the acid to produce two enzymes, gastrin for overall digestion and pepsin specifically for digesting proteins. The output from the stomach is food that has been partly digested into a semi-solid mass called chyme, which enters the small intestine and launches the next phase of digestion. 5 meters is small. Really? The name small intestine is quite misleading. Stretched out, the small intestine is typically around 5 meters, the longest organ in the body. The small intestine's contribution to the digestive process is twofold. Reabsorption of the nutrients generated from the digestive process into the bloodstream. About 95% of all reabsorption occurs in the small intestine. The small intestine is home to billions of microorganisms called gut flora, which aids in digestion and adds to the body's immunity. Digestion in the small intestine is aided by enzymes and bile secreted by the liver. Liver enzymes like lipase are especially helpful in digesting fat into easily absorbable fatty acids. Not longer, just wider. At 1.5 meters and shorter than the small intestine, the large intestine is the last organ in the digestive system and so named because it has a larger diameter than the small intestine. It is mostly a hollow coiled tube called the colon and has 4 distinct parts. ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and S-shaped sigmoid colon. The sigmoid colon connects to the rectum, which opens up into the anus. The large intestine's main function is the reabsorption of nutrients and water into the body. Because of this reabsorption, the leftover mass reaching the rectal cavity is very dry. The pressure built up in the rectum makes you relieve this waste through defecation. Sometimes even the intestine and the stomach disagree. Occasionally, the finely tuned process of digestion can hit some snags. Defects in the esophagus, stomach, and some parts of the small intestine, from anemia to cancers to ulcers, are diagnosed using an invasive procedure called endoscopy. The procedure involves inserting a flexible tube, which is fitted with a small camera, through the mouth to look for defects and collect samples for biopsy. Problems in the large intestine, including the common colon cancer, are detected by inserting a flexible tube fitted with a small camera into the large intestine through the anus. This procedure is called a colonoscopy. Today, colorectal cancer is so common that colonoscopies are recommended for all adults over the age of 50. A good digestive system plays a significant role in the well-being of the human body.
Our body sucks in a lot of bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens every day. They're all around us. What we take in could be whole pathogens, or they are fragments like protein or DNA. These unwelcome guests are together called antigens. Once inside the body, antigens are greeted by some decidedly unpleasant hosts. White blood cells, part of the body's immune system, are masters at identifying foreign intruders and destroying them with special disease-busting proteins called antibodies. But ever so often, a new pathogen appears that's especially tough. Something the body has never seen before. The usual white blood cells and antibodies are not effective against this menace. In such situations, the body calls up the special operations team. Lymphocytes, so called because they are transported around the body through the interconnected lymphatic system, are tailor-made for difficult intruders. There are two main types of lymphocytes. T cells, so called because they mature in the thymus gland near your heart, and B cells, which matures in the bone marrow. T cells usually have two variants, one which only identifies the intruder and calls for help. These are called helper T cells, and the other which attacks the foreign object directly, called the killer T cells. B cells, on the other hand, produce antibodies, our body's main disease-fighting weapon. Both T and B cells also have immunological memory. So once they see an antigen, they remember the attacker and are ready when it reappears anytime in the future. In some instances, the body can be tricked to produce antibodies by presenting it with a weakened antigen. This forms the basis of the science of vaccination. Once this weakened foreigner enters the body, the immune response gets triggered even though the weak antigen can't really make you sick. T and B cells identify the intruder and start preparing the body's defenses, which are available and ready when the real antigen strikes in the future. As an example, let's look at the exciting science behind Moderna's coronavirus vaccine. The Moderna vaccine contains a messenger or mRNA fragment of genetic material from the coronavirus. Remember, you can't get sick from the Moderna vaccine because you didn't get the virus itself. You just got some genetic instruction from it. Once the mRNA enters a human cell, it triggers the cell to make the virus's characteristic spike proteins on the surface. When the spiked cell presents itself to immune cells, they immediately identify it as foreign and start making antibodies. These same antibodies are available for any future spiked intruders, like the coronavirus. The human lymphatic system with T and B cell lymphocytes are a miracle disease-fighting machine. They can be cleverly put into action using vaccines.
Few human activities showcase the speed at which the human nervous system functions than the 100-meter dash at the Summer Olympics. The winner of the race is declared the fastest human on the planet, typically running 100 meters in less than 10 seconds. This athletic feat is a consequence of the synchronicity between the parts within the nervous system. The brain and spinal cord forms the central nervous system, or CNS. And a network of nerve cells distributed throughout the body forms the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The peripheral nervous system is responsible for carrying information to and from the central nervous system. For example, as the runners assemble at the start of the 100-meter dash, it is the sound of a gunshot that triggers the brain into sending a signal to the muscles to activate and start running. This signal from the brain to the muscles is relayed by the peripheral nervous system. The basic unit of the nervous system is this: a nerve cell or neuron. A neuron differentiates itself from all other cells in the human body because of its ability to exchange information with other cells. Through a series of electrochemical messages, a neuron can instruct or signal another cell to do certain things. The anatomy of a neuron makes it suitable to carry out this signaling. Like all cells, neurons have a cell body which has a nucleus with genetic matter protected by a membrane. But unlike other cells, the neurons have antennae sticking out which aids in information exchange, dendrites which project from the head, and a long axon which further splits into many terminals. The space where two neurons meet is called the synapse, the site of information exchange. In the synaptic space, two adjacent cells communicate, either through an electrical impulse or through the exchange of chemicals called neurotransmitters. The human body has hundreds of different types of neurons and as many known neurotransmitters. These interact with the many receptor cells to manifest thousands of different physical responses, from simple things like chewing food to more complex things like learning to play a musical instrument. The length of a neuron can vary from a few millimeters to over 2 meters. The cell bodies are usually concentrated in the brain and spinal cord, forming the gray matter of the nervous system. The long axons band together to form fibrous ropes called white matter, which can be found throughout the body. A malfunctioning of the nervous system, either through physical injury to the brain or spinal cord, or through diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, disrupts the body's ability to process information. This can manifest itself in the form of a stroke patient suffering from paralysis, or the inability to control different body parts, or hallucinations, or seeing things in patients with Alzheimer's or schizophrenia. A complete loss of nervous system functions pushes a patient into a coma, where all voluntary activities are suspended. The nervous system is responsible for controlling all voluntary activities within the human body, whether it is controlling your arms and legs, intangible attributes like personality, learning, and empathy, or running a 100-meter dash in the Olympics.
Over the last several decades, global disease burdens has seen a rising share of non-communicable diseases like cancer and heart disease, while the share of communicable diseases like malaria, TB, and AIDS has dropped. Crucially, for the pharmaceutical industry, non-communicable diseases usually lead to chronic conditions, which means the patients need medication on a continuing basis. while communicable diseases are usually not chronic and need one-time medication. So from a business perspective, it makes more sense to develop drugs for chronic, non-communicable diseases so you have a repeat customer base. In the US, for example, the largest pharmaceutical market in the world by far, non-communicable diseases are responsible for over 90% of fatalities. It's the same story in Europe, much of Russia, and even China. They contribute equal burdens in South Asia, and communicable diseases cause a majority of fatalities only in sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest region of the world. Given this distribution, a large share of industry attention is diverted to solving non-communicable diseases. Let's dig a little deeper into these fatality numbers. At the bottom of the spectrum are rare diseases like cystic fibrosis and Wilson's disease. They're estimated to cause around 100,000 fatalities a year. Drugs for rare diseases are called orphan drugs, which have high development costs and a low market size. This can lead to exponentially high treatment costs, as much as $700,000 for a single patient. Next up are communicable diseases like malaria, AIDS, TB, and diarrheal diseases. Because they are concentrated in the poorest nations in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, their drugs are heavily subsidized by governments and NGOs like the Gates Foundation. And the production of vaccines and therapeutics for communicable diseases are dominated by Indian companies. India produces 40% of all vaccines and over 80% of all antiviral AIDS medications. Next up, a group of diseases that affect the world's elderly. Geriatric diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and dementia kill over 3.5 million mostly elderly patients a year. Because rich countries have a higher median age, they bear a higher geriatric disease burden, generating a lot of interest from pharma companies. Cancer kills about 10 million people a year and is dominated by lung cancer in men and breast cancer in women. As with geriatric diseases, richer countries bear a heavier cancer burden, propagating a $100 billion market for cancer therapeutics. In fact, 5 of the 10 highest selling prescription medications are for cancer treatment, and the market is dominated by Novartis, Roche, and Amgen, which together sell over half of all cancer medications. Heart disease takes over 18 million lives every year. Just in the US, someone dies from heart disease every 37 seconds. Common underlying conditions like obesity and diabetes can lead to deaths from heart attacks. Treatment can range from a daily dose of the humble aspirin to beta blockers to statins, which is the gold standard. In fact, the #1 blockbuster drug of all time is Lipitor, which generated over $100 billion for Pfizer before its patent expired and generic competition kicked in. From orphan drugs to blockbusters, the world's pharmaceutical companies make sure that no patient is left behind. The evolution of pharmaceuticals can be understood through the advances in treating cancer. Cancer is the uncontrolled multiplication of abnormal cancer cells, causing a tumor. Cancer cells can then metastasize, get into the bloodstream, and invade the rest of the body. Cancer is as old as modern life itself. In fact, archaeologists have found what they believe are cancerous tumors in dinosaur fossils. And cancer treatments go back a long way as well, as evidenced by hieroglyphics detailing surgeries to remove tumors in ancient Egypt, which often meant that the patient's death was put on a fast track. We've come a long way from ancient Egypt, and treatment breakthroughs have usually come from interdisciplinary research, like physicists and mathematicians discovering X-rays and applying it to kill cancer cells through radiation therapy. These days, interdisciplinary research extends to computer science and bioinformatics, the use of artificial intelligence algorithms that screen thousands of cancer drug candidates to arrive at the ones with the most promise. Major pharmaceutical breakthroughs have also come from pure luck or serendipity, like Alexander Fleming discovering dead bacteria on a petri dish next to penicillin and the birth of antibiotics, and volunteers in Pfizer's clinical trial for their hypertension drug Viagra discovering the drug's more recreational benefits. So serendipity has played a big role in major cancer breakthroughs as well. The discovery that soldiers exposed to mustard gas during World War II showed a steep drop in white blood cells led scientists to experiment it on cancer cells, which explains why the first chemotherapy drug was nitrogen mustard. Like other chemical treatments, chemotherapy drugs use brute force, killing cancer cells but also causing unintended damage to other healthy cells that multiply rapidly, from hair and nails to white blood cells that provide immunity to other infections. Because of this, scientists in the past few decades have been seeking more targeted drugs, which led them to immunotherapy, the science of empowering a patient's own immune system and antibodies to recognize cancer cells and attack them, leading to the birth of biologic drugs. From arthritis to heart disease, biologics have shifted the paradigm in the pharmaceutical industry, and cancer treatment is no different. Through it all, the growth of industry regulations around the world have also played a crucial role in the evolution of pharmaceuticals. Regulatory bodies like the US FDA, established in the early 1900s and empowered with the force of law, have been instrumental in promoting legitimate innovations and preventing untested ones from harming public health, ultimately fostering a vibrant pharmaceutical ecosystem. So the evolution of the pharmaceutical industry is a story of interdisciplinary innovations helped on by serendipitous luck, but also of regulations working together to protect public health.
Ravi has gone to the doctor complaining of fatigue. He just hasn't been feeling up to it recently. A single observation like Ravi's fatigue is called a symptom. Typically, a symptom like fatigue, headache, or nausea is only evident to the person feeling it, and it's hard to detect on medical tests. Now, Ravi's fatigue could be caused by a whole plethora of reasons. From the mundane, like skipping dinner or work stress, to the most serious, like an underlying medical condition. The doctor decides to dig a little deeper. She finds out that fatigue is not an isolated symptom. Ravi is also feeling thirsty all the time. He's recently lost weight and sometimes has blurred vision. A collection of symptoms like this, which have been running for a while, is called a syndrome. This means whatever's causing it is not a one-off event like skipping dinner, but likely something that's going on with Ravi's biological systems. Even with his description of the syndrome, the doctor is not anywhere close to pinpointing the cause. The syndrome Ravi is describing could be caused by anything from irregular heartbeat to lung impairment to poor diet and exercise. Next, the doctor takes a quick blood pressure reading, which turns up higher than normal. And after some probing, Ravi lets out that he feels a lot of discomfort right after eating. This tells the doctor that Ravi has a metabolic disorder with the way his body is processing food and nutrients. A disorder is a syndrome that can be attributed to the malfunctioning of a specific body function or organ system. In this case, Ravi's digestive system. The doctor has Ravi take a blood test, and it turns out his blood sugar is through the roof. She concludes that Ravi has a disease, diabetes. A disease is a disorder that can be attributed to a specific pathology. You know the exact underlying condition for Ravi's original symptoms. The doctor concludes her investigation and discusses therapy options with Ravi. To recap, a symptom first noted by the patient becomes a syndrome when it's not isolated. A syndrome becomes a disorder when you know which body function is being affected. And a disorder becomes a disease when the specific underlying pathology is established.
This is glucose, or simply sugar, C6H12O6. It's a key energy source for the human body and the primary energy source for brain cells. Once food is broken down into glucose and it enters the bloodstream, it's monitored by beta cells here in the pancreas, an organ that's tucked in between the stomach and the large intestine. And if it notices high blood sugar levels, the pancreas releases this, insulin, a protein-based hormone that's almost as old as advanced life itself. Humans have known about insulin for a long time. It was first isolated from dog pancreas more than a century ago, and it was the first protein ever synthesized in the lab, making it available as an injection for therapy. That's the role of insulin. It regulates the transfer of glucose from the bloodstream into individual cells. And if you have low insulin level, sugar builds up in the blood, not getting absorbed into the cells. Once fasting blood sugar level exceeds 120 mg per dl, the condition is called diabetes. Diabetes is of two types. In type 1, the pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin at all, leading to high blood sugar level. You are left at the mercy of artificial insulin therapy. There's pretty much no other option. But in type 2 diabetes, the pancreas is producing enough insulin, but somehow your body becomes resistant to it, leading to high blood sugar levels. Adding more insulin is not going to help with type 2 diabetes. Instead, type 2 diabetes patients rely on medicines that reduce the blood sugar level artificially, along with a healthy diet and exercise. Diabetes causes a lot of carnage around the world. There's an estimated 420 million adult diabetes patients. It causes close to 4 million deaths every year from causes ranging from infections to heart attacks. And patients and governments spend close to 15 billion every year on diabetes treatment, making diabetes a central healthcare challenge around the world. Perhaps no other disease brings as much sense of loss and despair in our minds as cancer. It's an equal opportunity offender, afflicting everyone from young children to seniors and every part of the body, from the smallest drops of blood to our largest organs like the skin, intestines, and the brain. And our sense of helplessness is built on the fact that we still don't have a cure for most cancers. Cancer kills more than 10 million people a year worldwide and brings millions more to the brink of financial calamity, paying for treatments like chemotherapy. We know that cancer is the uncontrolled division of cells, usually forming a cell mass called a tumor. Tumors can be benign, where the growth is contained within the tumor and does not affect other body parts, or malignant, where the tumor cells get into the bloodstream and reach the farthest reaches of our body in a process called metastasis, creating additional tumors all over its path. In general, cell growth and division are normal and beneficial things for our body. But as important is for this growth to be controlled, and for cells that become old and damaged to die a natural death. Normal cells have the instructions to complete these tasks encoded in their DNA in the form of genes. For example, tumor suppressor genes prevent the uncontrolled replication of cells and the formation of tumors. Proto-oncogenes control normal cell growth and healthy cell division. And DNA repair genes take care of any faults in the genetic makeup before they lead to mischief at the cellular level. In cancer cells, this genetic instruction is broken at one or more places, possibly because of chance mutations of the DNA. Because mutations build up over time, older people are more likely to have more gene anomalies that lead to cancer. Cancer cells are also adept at bypassing a second line of defense in the body. The immune system, with specialized cells called lymphocytes, are trained to detect abnormalities like unusual cells and kill them. But for reasons not yet fully understood, cancer cells can mask themselves from these lymphocytes and thrive beyond the reaches of the immune system. The most promising cancer treatments of today target the cancer cell's ability to evade our immune system. This field, called immunotherapy, relies on biological drugs like monoclonal antibodies that attach themselves to cancer cells and in turn signal the immune system to attack them. Compared to traditional standard of treatment of chemotherapy, which relies on chemical drugs that attack all fast multiplying cells, immunotherapy drugs are much more specific and have much less side effects like weakened immunity and hair and weight loss. There are over 100 types of known cancers, and they're usually classified based on the type of cells that are affected. Cancer develops most frequently in epithelial cells that line the surface of organs, as opposed to the muscle and tissues inside the organ. Cancer of the epithelial cells is called carcinoma. Less frequently, cancer called sarcoma can also affect the soft tissue and muscles within organs and body systems. Leukemia is the cancer that affects blood-producing cells of the bone marrow. Lymphoma is the cancer that affects the cells of the lymphatic system transported along the lymph nodes. Then there's melanoma, which affects cells that produce melanin for the skin, myeloma that affects plasma cells, and cancers that affect nerve cells, both in the central and peripheral nervous systems. Finding cures that work on the scourge of cancer will take time, but breakthroughs in immunotherapy treatments offer the most hope for patients and their loved ones. Mental health issues plague millions of people around the world. In countries that keep mental health statistics like the US, over 50 million or 21% of all adults experience mental health issues. And over 13 million adults experience serious mental illness. The largest contributing condition among adults is depression, a disorder characterized by a persistent feeling of sadness, loss, and anger. Depression is so widespread, yet so subtle, that many don't even consider it a mental health issue that deserves treatment, asking victims to just shake it off. What people typically perceive as mental illness, with violent personality traits like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, actually make up just a small percentage of all mental illness. And among children, the predominant mental health issue is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, a condition characterized by short attention spans, an inability to focus at the task at hand, and resulting poor academic performance. ADHD afflicts more than 6 million children just in the US every year. Treating mental illness has historically been based on 3 separate approaches. The first, which says that mental illness is a hardware issue in the biology of the brain and neurotransmitters, and that treatment should focus on purely biological solutions put together by psychiatrists and neurologists. The second approach posits that it's all software, that mental illness is shaped by a person's unique experiences and circumstance, and that therapy should focus on talking through these issues with a trained psychologist. The third and more modern approach considers mental illness to be a combination of both hardware and software, and takes a combined medicines plus psychotherapy approach to treatment. There is a lot of evidence which points to underlying biology as a main cause for mental illness, like differences in MRI images of the brain. As far as we understand biologically, Mental illness results from the imbalance in two types of compounds in the body. Neurotransmitters, which take messages from different parts of the body to the brain and control our senses, ability to learn, attention, and sense of risk and reward, and some hormones evolved over millennia to control our fight or flight response to danger. The neurotransmitters dopamine and serotonin are made in the brain, while the hormones adrenaline or epinephrine and norepinephrine are made in the adrenal gland above the kidneys. Norepinephrine can also be made locally in the nerve cells, where it acts as a neurotransmitter. In general, an excess of these compounds in the bloodstream lead to excitement and risk-taking, while a lower than normal level leads to a feeling of depression. So drug-based treatment for mental illness either enhance the action of these compounds or inhibit them. So antidepressant medications like SNRIs used in the treatment of depression lead to more serotonin and norepinephrine in the brain by blocking the reuptake of these neurotransmitters into the nerves. It is in fact the primary treatment for major depression around the world. And drugs like amphetamine used in the treatment of ADHD and chlorpromazine used for treating schizophrenia have the opposite effect, reducing the concentration of dopamine and epinephrine in the brain. These medications are now the primary treatment for ADHD and psychotic conditions in the world. Understanding the biology and treatment of mental illness brings comfort to millions of suffering and stigmatized patients around the world. Paris, 1885. A frantic mother dragged her son Joseph through the streets. He had just been bitten by a very rabid dog, and she knew enough about rabies to know there was no hope for the boy once the symptoms set in. Her destination was the lab of this Parisian scientist called Louis Pasteur, rumored to have a cure for rabies. Pasteur's cure was to inject a vaccine, a weakened version of the rabies pathogen, into the patients before the symptoms set in. Based on his experiments with chickens, Pasteur knew that this would prevent the onset of rabies symptoms later on. Not only was the young boy saved by Pasteur's vaccine, but Joseph Meister would go on to become a groundbreaking vaccine researcher in his own right. Pasteur's work was based on thousands of years of our understanding of the human body's immune system, its natural ability to fight foreign invaders. At its core, the idea behind vaccine science is inoculation. Introduce a version of a pathogen into the body in a harmless form, let the body's immune defenses learn to fight the pathogen, so when the real thing hits, the immune system is ready with the required weapons. For this reason, the terms vaccination, inoculation, and immunization are sometimes used interchangeably. This understanding has long been used to develop remedies for one of the biggest scourges of human civilization, smallpox. There are records from ancient China and India of people being deliberately exposed to different forms of smallpox in order to trigger an immune response. And vaccination as we know today as a scientific concept started with Edward Jenner in 1796. Jenner noticed that the signature symptom of smallpox, pus-filled boils all over the body, was similar to that from cowpox. Except, cowpox was not deadly like smallpox. It was mostly harmless in humans. And the boils only appeared on the hands for a small period of time. Jenner concluded that whatever was causing cowpox could be used to trigger an immune response, which would then make the body ready to fight smallpox. He was right. Jenner's formulation of a smallpox vaccine heralded the dawn of a new era in vaccine formulation and development, which Pasteur would later utilize. Starting in the 1920s, vaccine development was turbocharged with advances in bacteriology and virology, where scientists figured out exactly what it is that Jenner and Pasteur were isolating, allowing them to experiment with different versions of the pathogen in the lab to select the ones that had the least side effects. As important were advances in our understanding of the immune system itself, and the knowledge that an immune response was actually the body generating pathogen-fighting proteins called antibodies, specific to each invader. This led to the rapid development of vaccines and antitoxins against diphtheria, tetanus, mumps, measles, typhoid, and tuberculosis, and the blockbuster polio vaccine by Jonas Salk in 1950, arguably the invention that has contributed the most to reducing human misery. Another breakthrough in vaccine science came with the discovery of recombinant DNA technology. This allows scientists to splice genetic instructions together to mimic many different aspects of a pathogen in completely unrelated molecules and cells. For example, COVID vaccines do not use weakened versions of the coronavirus. Instead, it uses recombinant DNA to express properties of the virus, like the characteristic spike proteins, onto other vectors that are harmless in humans, like the adenovirus from chimpanzees and Newcastle disease virus from birds. Antibodies generated against these hybrid viruses are found to be effective against the coronavirus when an actual COVID episode sets in. Before you can inject large swaths of the population with a disease agent, it is important to ensure that it is both safe and effective. This is done through clinical trials, where the vaccine is tested out on thousands of volunteers. Clinical trials are controlled, which means an equal number of participants receive the vaccine and a placebo. The volunteers or the trial administrators do not know who received the vaccine versus the placebo. After the trials, the vaccine and placebo populations are monitored to see what percentage of them develop the disease. Based on the result, the efficacy rate of a vaccine can be calculated. For example, if 100 patients in the placebo group developed COVID versus 2 patients in the vaccine group, then the vaccine is said to have an efficacy rate of 98%. Over the past 2 centuries, safe and effective vaccines have done more to eliminate infectious diseases and save millions of lives than perhaps any other human invention.